Let's get into our NBA offseason CBA mailbag. We have a lot of questions about how the new collective bargaining agreement actually works. What are the restrictions of these different aprons? And, why is it that, uh, teams have been so weird this offseason, right? Because, the Nuggets have been extremely quiet, but they're not the only team that hasn't made a lot of major moves. So our first question comes from Poissonian Distribution, and they ask, what are the penalties of being in the second apron? How onerous are they really when you look at them in the context of roster building? And actually, we have a graphic from Bobby Marks at ESPN, and he has the rules of the apron up here. There are two aprons, the first apron and the second apron. And we talked about one of the major restrictions of the second apron in particular. I think it's the most onerous one. That is the inability to aggregate contracts in a trade. So if you wanted to get a more expensive player, you can't put two or more contracts together to match their salary number and make that trade if you are over the second apron. But NBA Chicken, would you like to expound upon the most important, in your opinion, the most important restrictions of the second apron?
Yeah, I think the one that most teams are most fearful of is the moving back of future picks. So if you finish the season above the second apron, that means that pick that's 7 years out would be frozen. So for an example, the Suns next year are going to be over the second apron. Their 2032 first will be frozen. It can't be traded. So when they get to the next trade deadline, and that would have been the only first round pick they could technically trade because of the stepping rule, it's now completely untradeable as well. So it's one less asset to have in the clip, or as so to speak, whenever you're trying to make one of those bigger trades at the deadline. You're just going to be stuck with one less valuable asset that you could offer to get a player that can really upgrade the roster. If you're a repeat offender, it's basically over a 5 year span. If you're over the second apron three times, that pick, on top of being frozen, is moved to the end of the draft. So let's say 7 years from now, KD's gone, Booker's gone, Beal's gone, and the Suns were over the second apron this whole 3 of those 5 years. That 2032 pick is going to come up. They could be the worst team in the league, win 8 games, and they'll pick with the 32nd pick, most likely after the expansion or whatever. So they'd have the last pick in the draft in 2032, even if they were the worst team in the league. And this compounds. So if they were over the apron again over another 5 year stretch, that 2033 pick could be put to the end of the first round. And so not only are you crippling the ability to add to the team at the trade deadline during these seasons of contention, but you also are going to cripple yourself when you are actually bad potentially down the line. With those picks you couldn't trade, you're also going to be picking at the end of the first round. So that's one of the major implications a lot of teams are worried about.
I think it's a fair point that you make. One of the things that I sort of downplayed when I was looking at the frozen pick situation was, well, it's two pronged, like you say, right? Your pick is frozen, so you can't trade it. But then also, 7 years into the future, but then also they'll get moved to the back of the first round. I was thinking more about that second part, like, but if you're a team that's going to be good, then you should just not worry about those picks getting frozen. But they are so far into the future, or not frozen, but moved to the back, because you're going to have bad picks anyway if you're a good team. But it's so far into the future, you could be in rebuild mode and then you have nothing, you're not able to do anything at that point. I guess my counter to that being such an onerous restriction, if I was talking to these owners and I wanted to get them to spend money, I would just say, if you go into rebuild mode, you're selling off all your stars anyway, and you're going to get a bunch of other picks. So I wouldn't worry about your own picks so much. The inability to trade the picks that are far out because they're frozen and not being able, you can't use them in transactions, is actually a pretty serious concern when it comes to being able to upgrade roster spots, because you often have to use draft capital to upgrade those positions. It's so draconian. I found out about another one of the second apron restrictions the other day, which was that, so I was thinking about the fact that, okay, you can't aggregate contracts together to get a higher end player if you're already such an expensive team. That kind of makes sense, right? But one of the other restrictions that's there is if one of your players, let's say we were a second apron team and we decided to, what if we gave KCP a short deal? Right.
Mhm.
And then it was like let's say it was a 1 year deal. We go into next summer. We're definitely a second apron team anyway because of Jamal's extension. But then we decide to deal KCP in a sign and trade. So another team wants to sign him and trade for him. We basically can't take back contracts in that trade because you can generate a trade exception if you're a second apron team, but you can't use them unless you get under the second apron. That's actually bad for like that player too, because they basically have the option of going to a cap space team or getting an extension from the team that they're on. And it reduces their market because they can't go anywhere where the only option that that team has is a sign and trade. It's just like, it is incredibly onerous, I will say. Like, as much as I advocated for the Nuggets just blowing past the second apron to keep KCP because I believe in this team and I think they should be going all in right now, the fact of the restrictions is very real in terms of flexibility. But I was thinking more in terms of the alternative because the Nuggets are not a team that generally is like making midseason moves or making big changes in an off season anyway. So we're in the situation right now that I thought we would be if we lost KCP, which is like we have all this flexibility, but we're not really like doing anything with it. My question is actually whether it even makes sense for a team that is, as good as the Nuggets are, to just kind of like just barely duck the second apron. Then we get access to the taxpayer mid level, but we got worse because we lost a player. And the taxpayer mid level is basically the only like good thing that we gained in all of this. Is it worth it to just barely duck the second apron? Or would you want to do something like what Golden State did this year, where they just said, we're trying to duck the luxury tax. We're getting way under, and then we're going to get access to the full mid level exception. We're going to be able to participate in sign in trades, like getting real impactful flexibility. Does it make sense to try to like tinker around the margins and make yourself worse for a little bit of flexibility? Or is the real only option to stick with your team, blow past it, let's say like Boston Celtics style, or recognize you're not close like Golden State did and be like, we're not going to be paying X hundreds of millions of dollars in luxury tax next year. And then we're going to be able to reshape our roster like they have.
Yeah, my initial thoughts when the second apron came out was that there's really only 5 teams that should even consider being in the second apron, and those are the teams that have the 5 best guys in the league. You should be able to move around the margins if you already have your top 5 in place, even a 6-man in place. There's not really a move at the deadline necessarily that's going to be this dramatic improvement if you had access to that future first round pick. So in the case of the Nuggets, I had assumed way like last year that we would be a second apron team because we can just keep KCP. We're going to be a second apron team next year anyway when we give Jamal and AG their extensions. So is it just a matter of trying to be under the second apron early, just so we can be in the second apron an extra year later? I wasn't too sure what the strategy would be, but it ended up being that we wanted to stay under. So, in my opinion, it should just be something that you accept if you have a generational talent in their prime, that you just go into the second apron, you kind of figure it out from there. And you're really not figuring out a lot because it's your job to really understand and how to navigate those waters. So it shouldn't be just this shock of like, oh my gosh, we're a second apron team now. The team has already invested in those rookie scale contracts. When I'm talking about the Nuggets now, you're basically only getting the flexibility of having a tax MLE and free agency, and we've already seen that that's not worth a ton to sign a rotation level player. So my thinking the entire process was that we would be a second apron team. We just kind of navigate those waters and see if we needed to duck it another year. But that's not the approach we've taken. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
GMs have a very nice built-in excuse to not do certain things. It'll be fun going forward with this if this stays the same, deciphering what the motivations were for moves of all GMs across the league. Let's go to the next question though, which is from Mile High Woofer. It says, in a CBA context, I'd be curious to hear a discussion about the other contenders and what they look like going forward. So they mentioned the Celtics and OKC as two teams that have advantages in this, who seem like they have advantages in this context, but differing windows of opportunity. Obviously, the Celtics are defending champions. They look like they have their core locked up, at least for this year, a majority of them locked up for a while. And OKC is the new young hot team who are adding pieces this offseason right now. So, how would you start with this question, NBA Chicken?
So the Celtics obviously just won their championship and were basically already a second apron team going into this offseason. And you weren't going to not pay Jason Tatum his max contract, super max contract. So that was a given. And one of the things that I'm thinking that I was just bringing up when you're one of those teams is being in the second apron. If you're going to just go for it, just go for it. So they're not really afraid of the second apron right now. They have their top six, and so they're just going deeper into it. They're keeping Drew, they're keeping Derek White. They'll probably have Al Horford for the rest of his career, and Porzingis and Brown just signed his extension last year, and Tatum this year. So they they're just in the second apron, and they're just going to be comfortable there for at least 2 to 3 more years. And kind of like what Grace was saying, okay, so what if our pick 7 years from now is going to be at the end of the draft? We're trying to win like a three-peat right now. So they're going to have a couple of issues maybe at the trade deadline next year or the year after. They'll be wondering, why can't we sign someone like just off the bargain bin with a first round pick or a few second round picks? And it's just because they won't have the assets to do it. But the bet is that they have the core already in house and they can continue to compete with that core players. And then as far as the Thunder, like Grace said, they're on a different timeline. They're 2 years away from giving the extensions to Jalen Williams and Chet. So that's why they're able to afford someone like Isaiah Hardenstein and overpay someone like Hardenstein because they have the
Way.
flexibility.
I love Hardenstein, but that was a way overpay.
Yeah. And it could be
He's
a
the
player that
second highest, or I guess third. Okay, wait. There's 80, Yoke. There's Kristaps and Embiid.
Embiid,
Now
yeah,
Hardenstein is the fifth highest paid center in the NBA. I'll need to check on
potentially,
that.
Wow.
yeah. And he might not even start for them some nights because they have Caruso, Dort, Ja, Williams, and Chet. So he's going to be a player that's going to be playing almost north of 30 million and won't start all 82 games if he's healthy, which is just crazy to think about. But to kind of answer their question, their second apron scare is going to be 2 years from now when they have to potentially give, if Jalen Williams and Chet hit an all NBA team, a max deal, and they'd be just like the Nuggets, three max contracts, a ton of younger players. And they have another crop of young players that are going to be up for contracts. Kassan Wallace, they just gave Isaiah Joe and Wiggins their extensions. So they're going to be one of those teams that are pushing the second apron before you know it. So, if anything, they're just trying to take advantage of the fact that all of these guys are on rookie scale contracts while they can before they end up in a situation just like the Nuggets in a couple seasons.
Yeah, it seems like it's actually pretty tough if you end up being a team that drafts and develops really well, because you could end up in a situation like OKC, or will be in a few years, or where the Nuggets where you have three max contracts on your roster. Different kinds of max contracts for sure. Because MPJ and Jamal is currently on his rookie scale max, and will be on the veteran max in a while, with Jokic on the super max. And
Just piggyback off that point for a second. I don't know
yeah,
if you guys heard Bill Simmons' rant about this, but he really summarized my thoughts on the fact that a team like the Suns, who are going to be in the second apron, who essentially have put this team together from drafting one guy and just getting everyone else from other places. Then you have teams like the Thunder, the Nuggets, who drafted their main core and are still going to be penalized as if they built their team like the Suns did. And it's really shocking that there wasn't any provision in the new CBA for homegrown players, even if the provision was like the player must have played for the team 5+ years, or the player was drafted by the team and you get like a 10% salary relief or something. Like, imagine
Right.
if the Nuggets could get $3 million in compensation, I guess, against the tax for Jokic, like 2 million for Murray, and like a few million for MPJ. And then you have like just a small little pocket of money that maybe gets you under the second apron, or could potentially get you under the first apron. You never know, just depending on what kind of incentive there would have been to build teams internally. But we can thank CJ McCollum and the NBA Players Association for this
Yeah, no,
lack
I
of foresight.
completely agree with you. I completely agree with you on that. When I was first going through the CBA last summer, my first thought was like, okay, like if you really want to encourage like homegrown talent and all of that, there must be some kind of exception in there. It's similar to like what you're proposing is similar to what they do with veteran minimum contracts, right? A lot of people were up in arms about DeAndre Jordan's announced veteran minimum being, I think it was 3.6 million, but the cap hit is only 2 million because the league basically not, I don't think they subsidize it. I think they like it's like a cap hit thing where it
Mhm.
doesn't count as much toward the cap as the actual amount of cash that they're getting paid, so that veterans that have played X many years don't get completely pushed out of the league by rookie scale minimums and other kinds of minimums, basically, right? So it's just like the US tax code, it's a statement of priorities, right? You can write in whatever you want, and they could have, and they didn't. I don't know how much thought actually went into this by the Players Association besides getting a salary floor, but actually, like, related to that, we get a question from Mile High Pete that asks, do you think these rules will cost mid and late career vets money long term? I thought it was interesting when CP3 signed with the Spurs for $11 million. They made sure to tell us it was low enough that he could sign with any team if bought out. Doesn't seem player friendly. Now, the note that I will put on this is that we didn't talk about this specific restriction in of the aprons, but I believe if you are a first or second apron team, you are not allowed to buy out a player that makes more than the mid-level exception. So CB3 is going to be making less than the mid-level exception, and I think that is what Pete is referring to. So at the deadline, if a team wanted to buy him out, it expands the market of teams that would be allowed to do so.
Yeah, I think as long as the player makes less than the full mid-level exception, then any team can sign him. Yeah, that's the wording, I think.
So the question is like, do the new rules cost these mid and late career vets money? Because you see like CP3 potentially like took a smaller deal than maybe the Spurs were even willing to offer him, just because he wanted to be able to have that flexibility to be bought out by somebody else at the deadline.
Yeah, I think that's a great example for one. And then you can also look at DeMar DeRozan's market right now. There are
Mm-hmm.
plenty of teams that might have been able to sign him, but they also would have probably gone into the second apron, or because they're already in the second apron. I mean, look at the Lakers. They aren't going to be able to even give him a tax MLE because they're in the second apron. And even if they weren't, the most he could have signed for was like 5 million. And so it'll be very interesting in future free agent markets where these older veteran players go, because outside of maybe ring chasing for a minimum like the Warriors got to do with a couple of players, some teams are going to only be able to offer that. And a contender might not want to spend the tax MLE on DeMar DeRozan, as we've seen. Seems like a few teams are passing on that opportunity right now, and you could say DeRozan's value is maybe around 15 million this coming season, and it doesn't seem like he'll be getting anywhere close to that at this time.
So actually, on the other side of that, We got a question from Ed Helinsky, who asks, in your opinion, has this crazy NBA salary money gotten out of hand? And is it starting to cause a disconnect between the league and its Joe Blow average NBA fans? Will, what do you think about that question? I know we had a conversation on the Four Corners podcast the other day about the NBA like having like a marketing issue, and maybe like part of that is this disconnect with between players and fans. But what do you think about just like the overall rises in salaries causing a disconnect?
I don't know if like the top tier players making like 50 million is gonna cause a disconnect for an average fan. I mean, I guess I don't know if they're thinking of a fan who is just really annoyed that elite athletes get paid like this ridiculous amount of money. But I
But
definitely
fans
see
always
it.
felt like that.
Yeah,
Like no matter how much
yeah,
they're
but it's
making,
like
'cause it's going to be
it,
more
it
than.
but I feel like most fans are kind of used to that and they accept it because we like to watch the sport. But if they're referring to it as just it affecting the CBA and what teams can do to keep them together, because it does suck, like we were just saying, if teams draft well and you're being penalized for it. And the league used to say they wanted star players to stay on their teams that drafted them because they want the fan base to be able to like connect with them and feel like, they're not just losing out because they're a small market and these stars are going to LA or wherever. It kind of almost happened like that without the CBA because I feel like every team has at least like one pretty good star player, maybe not like superstar, but the talent's pretty well distributed. This is a lot of rules to be putting in at one time with the CBA and a lot of limitations that even like GMs are, I don't know how they feel about it. I don't know if they feel like they totally understand it and they're comfortable with their strategy, whether that's to completely avoid it or to think about how to navigate around it. I know the average fan's not going to want to learn all this CBA stuff. And, even like kids, like my nephew, like when we lost KCP, and I'm like, yeah, KCP left for the Magic. He has no idea why. It's very confusing. Even we don't necessarily know why, but it's hard to explain like money like that to average fans. And I do like player movement. I think it's fun. I think it's fun to like see new combinations of players play together. Obviously, it can get out of hand, like with the Warriors and such, but it really sucks right now as Nuggets fans to basically being penalized for being good and drafting so well. So,
Yeah, my thing is that it's bad unless it helps my team.
yeah.
I think that
Yeah.
I agree with you that I don't know about it like a disconnect between like the average person and the athletes. I think that disconnect is just there ever since maybe like the 2000s because it's an entertainment business and that's just how it goes in every entertainment business. The highest paid people have a disconnect between them and their fans because average people just don't make that kind of money. But you could even say like in contrast to, something like even like acting, like in the NBA anyway, a veteran minimum is now in the range of 2 to over $3 million a year. But it's not that I want like veteran minimum guys to make less money just so that they can be closer to the average Joe. Like they put their bodies through a lot. They have to travel a ton. They have so much uncertainty in their careers. This is just kind of the nature of this job. I think that like superstars, I don't know that there's going to be as much player movement at the top end, but I think we're going to see a lot more player movement from role players. Maybe that's just my experience from the last 2 years watching Bruce go, Jeff go, and
Mm,
KCP, because I think the franchises, for the most part, like we have the counterexample in the Clippers letting Paul George walk, but I think the franchises, for the most part, are going to try to do whatever they have to keep their top end talent. They're going to give them their maxes. Even the Clippers were supposedly willing to offer Paul George the max for a year less than he wanted, right? We haven't seen anybody actually take a discount. I know like LeBron like alluded to perhaps being willing to take a discount for the Lakers if they'd been able to like get a real like player. But until we see a superstar take a discount, I actually think that what's going to happen is we're going to see more movement from the middle and bottom class of the NBA and less at the top, just because like you said the talent distribution is at the top end wider in the NBA now So teams are going to do whatever they can to keep their guy. I just don't know that there's going to be as much benefit, especially if it's hard to keep a super team like, supposed super team like the Phoenix Suns. Does Kevin Durant like ask for that same move if he understands the kind of restrictions that the team's going to be under by virtue of having him? Does Beal go there if he understands the kinds of restrictions the team's going to have by virtue of having him? I don't know. I think that like 2 or 1.5 really off seasons in, it's just not enough time to really be able to fully assess what kinds of medium and long-term implications the CBA is going to have with how teams are actually going to operate. Because you saw last summer, I don't think it was nearly as hesitant last summer as it was this one. And I know there are some new triggers that kicked in this year, but most of the rules went into effect last summer. And we are already seeing like a huge shift in behavior from front offices just 1 year in. And so I think that everyone's still trying to like figure out what it is that they're going to evolve into as a front office in order to operate under the new CBA. Do you have any thoughts on that, NBA Chicken?
What I had kind of written down was how the economic scale differences between the NBA and average Joe is just going to get bigger. We already have this new TV rights deal coming up pretty soon. It's just going to make like a Supermax 5 years from now worth like $500 million probably. So it's just going to get worse in that regard. But overall, I'm kind of with Will. We're going to probably get a little more role player movement, which should make for some interesting dynamics in the coming seasons.
Yeah, last thing I want to say, is there any scenario where, because we've been talking about parity a lot and how dynasties are going to be harder to maintain, where like the Celtics, for example, could win like 4 out of 5 years because they do have this pretty good alignment of players that are falling into their roster. And I know they're going to be in the second apron. It's going to be super expensive and punitive. But like the rest of the league also is under these restrictions. It's going to be hard to build rosters to compete with those types of teams. And I know it's the Celtics and whatever, we can debate that. I could see a dynasty being maintained because teams can't just like trade for a star that's just going to change their team completely, like, the Cavs were able to do when they were trying to compete with the Warriors and stuff like that.
I guess I would just like, what I would say to that is that I don't think trading for a star was going to make the kind of impact even before this new CBA, because that has less to do with like the CBA's impact on parity and more to do with the current distribution of top end talent in the league and that impact on parity, because that's where I see the parity is at the top, right? Obviously top 5 guys are only on 5 teams, but you have maybe like 15 arguably top 10 guys in the league now. And I don't know that it's ever been as widely talented as it is. So adding a star to your team is not necessarily going to help you like compete with the Boston Celtics, because they have Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and then all these pieces that fit around them. But I can also see this situation that you're describing where they win 4 out of 5, because what happens, like, you could just be locked into a team by virtue of the restrictions of the second apron, but that team could just be good enough to compete forever long. I think it has to do with like, where are the stars in their prime? How is injury histories with everybody? Is everybody just like really consistent? It's hard to be that for 5 years in the NBA, right? Even like the KD Warriors dealt with issues. I don't know that the Celtics are quite on that level just in terms of talent as a team. So I think it's just all the same luck that you would have had to have before to be able to rip off like 4 out of 5. Maybe the new CBA makes that more difficult, not because teams can't sign a new star, but because it's just harder to get better.
The only thing I'd add to that is we might see some teams do what the Sixers did this past year, completely aligning all of their free agents to be free agents at the same time, creating all of this salary cap room. You can bring in some guys that you had on the roster previously. You can sign Paul George, things like that. It doesn't always work out where you have the salary room to sign a star and the star wants to go there. But
right. And I
I think
don't think
it's
Paul George wanted to go to Philly. I'm
yeah,
maintaining that. I think that he just decided to not blink in the stare down that he had with the Clippers. So
yeah. It's definitely gonna take some luck, and it's gonna be, I think, a viable strategy for some GMs just to have the free agent cap space room and try to improve that way. Because if you don't have one of the top 5 guys, that might be your avenue for getting one. So we'll see how teams approach it.
All right, so the last question from Beaston25_8. Why didn't the new CBA make the East stop being awful? Man, you could take this in so many ways.
Yeah,
Go ahead and start, NBA Chicken.
it's very interesting because the East is so top heavy. They have the Celtics, Bucks, Knicks, and Sixers, and then there's this middle tier now with the Pacers and the Magic. But then most of the teams after that, I guess I should include the Heat there too. But most teams after that, like the Hawks, the Pistons, the other teams down there aren't really first of all, they're not well run. Most of them are still, I don't think any of their GMs have been there longer than like 3 years. So no cohesive plan has been in place. There hasn't been the best drafting. I mean, you look at the Bulls, they've had great opportunities, but have missed on a lot of picks. They've traded away Laurie Markkinen. Like, they went all in and were good for like 6 months, and then they haven't been good for like 3 years. So you have these teams that are just in this revolving door of mediocrity, or they've just been in the basement of the NBA for many years, like the Pistons. And the CBA isn't really going to help them get any better because of these restrictions. I mean, you do have teams like the Magic that were smart enough to have cap space and get a guy like KCP, but this is just because they finally have some smart guys in the front office and have a direction that they know they're trying to go in. And so when you think of it that way, there's 7 teams that know what direction they're going in and 8 that haven't really defined that well. And then you look at the West and it's like 11 teams that have defined and know where they're going. And then maybe 4 that don't have any clue what they're doing. I'd say maybe the only team that doesn't know what they're doing is maybe the Trailblazers, because even the Spurs and the Jazz, I mean, their front offices have made some solid moves in the past. They just haven't had the talent to really progress really well. So that's just kind of how I see the dynamics between the East and the West.
Yeah, you laid it out perfectly. I mean, if the CBA makes it so that the top teams have trouble maintaining, the bottom teams still have to make smart decisions to get themselves out. Yeah, and it's just the East has more bad teams towards the bottom than the West. Yeah, Grace, we love the East is not as good as the West agenda. I mean, it's just a fact, not an agenda. What do you think about the East, and will they ever get better?
now it's a widely accepted fact. I've been on this agenda since last year. I think that the East has a lot of these like you say, these like middle teams where their top end talent, not just like their one star, but like say their top 3 guys, don't necessarily fit as well as the middle tier of the West, to where you can say, like, I see this team being competitive in a playoff series, unless they're, in the Eastern Conference. Like you saw the Pacers, they also got like a lot of injury luck, but they were able to make the conference finals with like one of the worst defenses in the league because it's not as competitive out there. But then you have a team like you have the Cavs and the Magic. I think that really those teams in particular, you could even like compare them to say the Pelicans and the Grizzlies, where they're a lot more defensively oriented. You're not quite sure like where to rank their top guy. And then the second star is a question. The Magic are incredibly young, so I almost want to leave them out of this conversation because I had no idea how good they were going to be last season, particularly defensively. Offensively, they're probably the most challenged of any of the teams I listed. But I do think that the West tends to, like, their teams tend to have the highest of the top end talent. I've been on this whole kick about how the West has drafted almost every dynamic guard in the league. And you can look at the ones that are in the East, like Jalen Brunson, like Donovan Mitchell, and say, nope, those came from the West as well. You could give the East Kyrie because, I mean, he was the number 1 pick, and who else is Cleveland going to pick in that draft? But then the Hawks got Trey, but Luka was an option. So then you're like, okay. And then they have Tyrese Maxey. Yeah, they traded back. I just think that they make really interesting choices with their drafts. I think that it's interesting that the East doesn't seem to like value size as much outside of really Embiid and Philly. You could say the Bucks value size, but I think the Brook fit is more about like we need a 3-point shooter next to Giannis, and Brook was the best like stretch 5 that they could get at that time. So I think it's just interesting how they approach their roster building, not just around their stars, but with their like how they draft their stars in the first place. But yeah, the CBA is not going to fix the East. The East needs Jesus at this point.
You just need to get rid of the conferences.
They really do. They really do.
Then we'll be good. That will conclude this episode of What's in a Game. We did get to 200 subs, though. We got about 200 subs, which is awesome. So thanks for everyone who subscribed. We hope you continue to subscribe. Next episode is a special one, so look out for that. We're having renowned media member from the Denver Nuggets themselves, Matt Brooks, on, and so that will be fun. And
you gonna check that episode out?
Yes,
absolutely.
Everyone check that out. Before we go though, NBA Chickens, or anything you want to say or just plug? Or obviously everyone follow his Twitter, and I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, I have nothing really to shout out. Now that the off season slowly slowing down, I might actually get off Twitter for once in a little bit, but I might have a little article write up summarizing the Nuggets off season, and then probably just take a chill pill for a little while. So yeah, and I'm basically just on Twitter. I do have a YouTube channel, but I haven't posted to it in years. So yeah.
Well, cool. If you decide to, we'll definitely would love to see that. I really enjoy your writing and your articles. It's always very well written and detailed and laid out, and I love the tiers that you do. So it was really fun having you on the episode. Really appreciate it. Massive fan. And yeah, just remember everybody to like, subscribe, share this episode, follow us on Twitter, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you're listening. We really appreciate it. And remember, winning is fun and losing sucks.